A young boy named Dylan is preparing for Halloween by creating his own Batman suit. After putting on the mask he made, he takes a selfie and sends it to his friend, Brady. Shortly after, his father, Michael, arrives home accompanied by Dylan's grandfather, Joe. Upon seeing Dylan dressed as Batman, Joe expresses mild disapproval, suggesting that Dylan might be a bit too old for superheroes. Michael, however, sees this as a chance to strengthen family bonds and encourages a more supportive outlook. Later, Dylan's mother, Helen, informs Joe that he'll be staying in Dylan's room. As Joe settles in, he finds Dylan feeding his pet frog. Looking around, Joe notices comic book posters covering the walls. Dylan warmly offers Joe the chance to read any of his comics if he's interested. Enthusiastically, Dylan also shares drawings of a new superhero character he's been creating, eager to show Joe his imaginative work. Joe tells Dylan that he needs to be alone. Dylan then goes into his older brother Bryce's room, where Bryce is making out with his girlfriend. Bryce doesn't want him there, so Dylan goes to lie down on the couch. When Michael arrives, Dylan tells him that Grandpa is really mean to him. Michael explains to Dylan that Grandpa's dad died young, so he had to be different. He had a different life. After Michael leaves, Dylan resumes working on his drawings. The next morning, Joe is seen undergoing physiotherapy. Meanwhile, Helen asks Bryce to pick up Dylan from school, but Bryce refuses. Joe volunteers to go instead. Michael expresses concern about Joe driving, but Joe insists on doing it. At school, Dylan meets up with Brady, who informs him that he won't be joining him for Halloween this year. Joe returns to his workplace and meets with his boss, Lance. Eager to resume his duties, Joe expresses his desire to get back to work. However, Lance hands him his pension plan instead. Joe, frustrated, reminds him that he has dedicated his entire life to this job and isn't ready to retire. Lance explains that with major contracts on the way, he can't assign work to someone who may not be able to keep up. Disheartened and angry, Joe leaves. Joe arrives late to pick up Dylan from school. As Dylan gets into the car, he says he hates school. Joe responds that he would do anything to go back. He was extremely popular in his school days. He recalls the night of the senior prom when he and his football team lifted the principal's car onto the roof, an act that made him a legend at school. Dylan then shares that his friend Brady doesn't want to be around anymore. Later at home, Dylan checks the mailbox and finds a package addressed to Joe from Wham Comics. Joe opens it to discover a ring inside, Dynoman's ring, which he had ordered when he was a child. Dylan is surprised to learn that Joe was once into comic books as well. Joe assumes it's a prank by Kenny, one of the guys from his shop. When Dylan asks about his old comics, Joe mentions that he had given them to Michael. They go to the storage and find the comics stashed away. Joe tells Dylan that Dynoman was a miner, just like his own father. One day, while working underground, a stick of dynamite exploded and embedded 3 radioactive rocks into Dynoman's ring. Each rock gave him a unique power, strength, speed, and flight. Curious, Dylan asks how the powers worked. Joe, slightly irritated, questions why their generation always needs explanations for everything. He then tells Dylan about Dynoman's archenemy, Volt. Dynoman had once saved Volt's village from a meteor by smashing it with his ring. However, some debris fell on a house, killing a man and a woman, while their young son played outside. That boy grew up to become Volt. Volt, as a boy, had gathered all the remnants of the meteor, which had absorbed the power of Dynoman's ring, and used them to construct his helmet. Joe explains that while this is standard superhero material, the stories he used to write had more flair. He stopped writing them because, in his words, you can't play with superheroes forever. Dylan points out that Dynoman's ring came to him when he needed it most, and now Joe has received a ring he ordered 60 years ago. Dylan encourages Joe to try the ring. Joe puts it on, it fits perfectly, but he doesn't feel any different. He tells Dylan that it's just a toy. Still not convinced, Dylan urges Joe to hit the boxing bag. Joe becomes frustrated and tries to take the ring off, but it won't budge. As Joe's temper flares, Dylan asks him to stop, but Joe grows angrier, and Dylan leaves the room. Suddenly, the ring begins to glow. Dylan rushes into his room, brushing past his mother. Later, he skips dinner. At the table, Michael asks Bryce not to have the football on the table, but Bryce insists that the coach wants him to keep his hands on it at all times. Michael then tells Joe that Lance called and offered him a generous retirement package. Joe responds that he'll take it in 20 years. Michael advises him to consider taking it now. Joe, irritated, says that he's always believed in Michael, and Michael should have the same belief in his father. Helen then asks Joe if he truly did believe in Michael. Michael calls Dylan to join them, and Dylan eventually arrives. Helen tells Joe that if Lance is concerned about him returning to work, then they simply can't allow him to go back. Joe becomes frustrated and tells everyone that he's the reason they're receiving the big orders at work. Meanwhile, Dylan notices that Joe's ring has started glowing. Tension rises as Michael and Joe get into a heated argument. Helen, trying to restore order, tells Bryce to stop playing with the ball. Bryce throws it aside, but Joe catches it midair and crushes it in his hand. Dylan looks at Joe and sees the ring glowing brightly. Joe, still in disbelief, is unsure of what's happening. Dylan urges Joe to hit the boxing bag again. When Joe refuses, Dylan begins to provoke him. Agitated, Joe punches the bag with full force, smashing it into the wall. Overcome with excitement, he slams his hand down on the table, accidentally breaking it in half. He also realizes that his legs are working better than they have in years. The next day, Joe returns to his shop and effortlessly lifts a large log of wood, leaving Lance stunned. Meanwhile, at school, Dylan tries to talk to Brady, but Brady brushes him off. Soon after, other boys begin teasing Dylan by calling him Batman. Embarrassed and hurt, Dylan runs out of class. Brady follows and catches up with him. He apologizes and explains that the boys had seen Dylan's masked selfie in his photo stream by accident. Dylan, still upset, tells Brady he's angry not just because the photo was seen, but because Brady didn't stand up for him and laughed along with the others. At home, Michael asks Joe if he's feeling alright. Joe replies that he's feeling fantastic and shares that the doctors have given him full clearance to return to work. He adds that he'll be going back the next day. Later, Joe visits Dylan in his room. Dylan shows him his phone, where classmates are mocking him online, calling him Dress Up Dylan. Joe tells him that if he could remove the ring, he would gladly give it to Dylan. Dylan then asks Joe to help him by putting the principal's car on the school roof. Joe admits that the story wasn't entirely true, they never put the car on the roof. They just moved it a few blocks away, and he exaggerated the tale. Joe tells Dylan not to worry about the kids at school and says he'll give him some space for now. But Dylan agrees with him and says he doesn't need those boys anyway. Instead, he asks Joe if he would go trick-or-treating with him. Joe smiles and agrees. At work, Joe takes an early lunch break and races through the city using his newfound super speed, eventually meeting up with Dylan. Dylan excitedly shares his strategic plan to get the best candy while trick-or-treating. Back at the workshop, Lance is in the middle of a heated conversation with a frustrated customer. He had promised to deliver 150 tables in 2 days, but failed to meet the deadline. Joe steps in and confidently assures the customer that the entire order will be completed by the next day. As Joe gets to work fulfilling the order, Dylan heads home and gets into his Halloween costume, waiting eagerly for Joe to return. Meanwhile, Michael talks to Dylan, noting that both Joe and Dylan have been acting differently lately. He asks if Dylan knows where Joe is. Dylan casually responds that he's probably out having fun with his superpowers. Confused, Michael presses further, and Dylan tells him about the superpowered ring Joe received. At the shop, Joe is relaxing and having drinks with his coworkers. Suddenly, Michael storms in, furious. Joe apologizes and says he'll head home and talk to Dylan. But Michael, still upset, tells him that all Dylan wants is his grandpa, just like Michael once wanted his own father. And now, Joe is ruining things with Dylan in the same way he did with Michael. Joe tries to defend himself, telling Michael that everything he does is for the family. But Michael pushes back, saying it's always been about Joe, what Joe wanted, what he needed, what he couldn't get from his wife or from Michael. That's why he buried himself in work. Michael says he truly believed Joe had changed, but the moment his job was on the line, his knee miraculously healed itself. Joe, suddenly worried, asks where Dylan is. Michael replies that Dylan is in his room crying, because the one man he looked up to stood him up. Michael tells Joe to pack his things and leave. He walks out, and just then, Joe collapses, the ring has stopped working. Back at home, Dylan, filled with frustration, throws away his costume and comics. As he glances at a comic panel featuring Volt, he remembers the table Joe smashed earlier. He realizes that pieces of the broken wood may have absorbed some of the ring's power. Dylan gathers the glowing fragments and, inspired by Volt's look, begins crafting a powered mask using the wood and references from the comic. When he puts it on, the mask glows yellow. Meanwhile, Michael returns home and tells Helen that Joe doesn't care and that he's done trying to make him care. As he gets ready to check on Dylan, Joe unexpectedly arrives and begins searching the house. He finds the Volt comic panel and Dylan's power tools. Understanding what Dylan has done, Joe quietly removes the ring from his finger and drops it on the floor. Joe heads to Bryce's room, asking if he's seen Dylan. Bryce tells him there's a dance at school tonight and he saw Dylan leaving in costume. He adds that Dylan said, "Tonight's going to be legendary." At the school, Dylan arrives and begins pushing a car, determined to fulfill the story. Back home, Michael searches the garage for Joe but instead finds the glowing ring lying on the floor. After pushing the car against the wall, Dylan climbs onto the school roof. He ties one end of a rope to a pole on the roof, then climbs down using it and secures the other end to the car. Meanwhile, Joe arrives at the school, searching for Dylan. Determined, Dylan begins pulling the car up toward the roof. As he gets the car halfway up, he loses his grip and falls. The car begins to slip, but Dylan manages to catch it with his hands. Struggling, he opens the door and attempts to push it onto the roof. Unable to hold on, he falls inside the car, and his helmet comes off. Now stuck inside, he finds himself unable to open the door. Joe spots the car dangling from the rooftop and climbs up. He calls out to Dylan, telling him he no longer has powers and instructs him to stay forward. Joe opens the car door and tries to pull Dylan out, but in the process, he gets stuck inside as well. The car slips and begins to fall off the roof. At that moment, Michael appears, wearing the ring. Using his newfound powers, he catches the falling car and carries it back up to the roof. Joe and Dylan climb out safely. Michael tells Joe that he had gone looking for him in the garage, saw the ring, and it simply took over. As Dylan shuts the car door, the alarm goes off, drawing the attention of the other kids. Michael grabs Joe and Dylan, and together they fly away just as the students come outside, laughing at the sight of a car parked on the school roof. Back home, Joe decides to bury the ring, saying it only comes to those who truly need it, and he doesn't anymore. He begins sharing some of his superhero ideas with Dylan, which Dylan says he wants to start sketching. As they leave, a small plant begins growing where the ring was buried. The episode ends with the plant starting to glow in Dynoman's colors. Like and subscribe the channel for more videos like these.